I think the first one is to build business acumen early. Yeah. So I think this isn't HR processes, procedures, that's all really important, but it goes back to what I said earlier. It's about understanding the business. How do they make money? What's their products? What are the leadership's priorities?
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Plumm Pod, where we talk about all things HR and mental health. I'm your host, Georgia, founder of Access HR, and on today's episode, we are joined by Harry, where we're talking about how to be more strategic as an HR partner to accelerate in your career. Harry has an extensive career in HR, and it's one that is really admirable. There are so many tips and takeaways from this episode, and I cannot wait for you to learn more. And before you go, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. It allows us to keep the conversations going and bring on better and bigger guests. Thank you. Hi, Harry.
Hi, Georgia.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. What a great studio.
I know, it's incredible. So we are at the studio in London, and today I am so excited to talk about you, to talk about your background and to give our listeners a really good understanding of your journey to where you are today. There's a question I like to ask every guest, and the question is, was it the plan to go into HR or did it happen by chance?
Absolutely wasn't the plan. So I don't know what other people have said. So my degree was actually an IT degree. And when I was looking to graduate, I think it was a job interview with Microsoft that I had, and I'd got all the way through. I think it was like 5 rounds or something like that. And I was determined I was going to get this job. And then their feedback was my degree wasn't technical enough, but my personality had got me this far. And maybe I should consider roles in HR. And then it was 2009 when it was the credit crunch. There wasn't many graduate positions. So I said, right, I'm going to apply for HR and IT jobs. And I got a HR job, and the rest is history. So no, that's how I ended up in HR.
And that's a long career, really, in the industry. And for the listeners, you've progressed massively. So starting HR graduate all the way through to HR director, which is an incredible career. And I'd love today if we could really unpick that. During your career, has there been particular points as a HR professional that stick in your mind in terms of like development?
Yes, absolutely. So 15 years, and I joined with 0 HR experience.
Oh, wow.
So I think those first couple of years, it was definitely the imposter syndrome of, do I know what I'm doing? People are coming to ask me questions that have got like 30-year careers, and I'd be giving them the answer, you think, but you just need to do it confidently. When I look at where my career's really sort of accelerated, would be one of the first points was around taking on additional work. So I think sometimes, especially if you watch TikTok and some other social media, people say don't take on that additional project if there's not extra pay. But absolutely, I did a lot of sort of projects where you might be seconded to go and do a restructure. One of the things I remember was, this is probably a couple of years into my career, I was on a call chairing it with a load of directors, telling them what we were going to be doing this week. And it was a bit of a pinch me moment, like, how am I here? How am I doing this? But certainly doing a couple of those projects that were on top of the day job, what really elevated my sort of profile within the company and got me known. I think on from that was I progressed within the business. I then got to work on Royal Mail's 5-year strategy, which obviously was a huge thing for all 130,000 employees. Worked on that with external sort of consultants from different banks. And I remember sort of pulling together the pack and taking it in along with finance and some other functions. And sort of the external advisors sort of giving a lot of feedback on other areas, shall we say. But mine almost being, yes, that's fine, a tick in the box. And it was like, these are like experts from top investment banks, and they're saying that the strategy that I helped to pull together is sort of, there's no comments, which was another sort of pinch me moment. And then I think finally it was more around, latterly in my career, was sort of really looking at what does the business need to achieve, and then sort of directly linking HR plans, which I think we'll come on to.
Amazing. I completely agree with your point where you're saying in the early days of your career, taking on more work, saying yes, the way that I was able to excel in my career, I was a sponge. I took it all in. I've said yes to everything. And I know there is a lot of stigma around being a yes person, But that put me front of mind for projects, and that allowed me to grow massively. Another key part of that was relationship building with senior stakeholders, which I think you've just spoke about there. And I can imagine during the second phase that you just spoke about then, that you needed to build really important relationship with stakeholders. How did you do that?
I think for me, it was about becoming that like trusted advisor to them. So often from a fairly junior stage, being thrown into these rooms with fairly senior people to make them asking you input on some fairly big decisions. You need to be rock solid in your opinion that this is what we need to do. Sort of listen to what they're saying, but almost really have that confidence to say, this is from a HR professional. This is what we need to do, and then almost them taking that on board and then sort of going through. And it can feel strange at first, especially when you are a lot more junior or the most junior person in the room. But you have to remember that you're in that room for a reason, to give that expertise.
Such great advice. And I know for our listeners, they will be facing that battle every day as well. And another battle that I face personally is, unfortunately, in HR, we are known as quite operational and compliant driven. And that transition I found particularly hard, from moving from being the day-to-day operations to being a strategic partner. And I don't know if you felt the same.
Yes, it's the age old, we were joking about this earlier, it's the age old, you need to be more strategic, but giving absolutely no direction. And if you were to look up in a book, I don't think it would really tell you how to make HR more strategic, apart from be a strategic partner. But what does that mean?
And what would you advise anybody who is listening, who is facing that question internally? How do you become more strategic?
I think, first of all, as I mentioned, is about becoming that strategic partner. So absolutely having that, gaining the trust of senior people within the business, sort of really knowing your stuff as a HR professional. I think the second bit is about really understanding the business. So I think this is not just from a process perspective, which I think I was certainly guilty of earlier in my career. I know the grievance policy, I know the conduct policy, but actually, how does the business make money? What are the most profitable parts of the business? Where does that need to transform over the next few years? So for example, I might be working with a bit of the business that was declining over those 5 years, or maybe if you're working with another bit that's going to be, the future of the business, really focusing on that. So I think that's the second part of it. I think the third bit, and I think this is kind of the turning point for me, was around sort of outlining where HR outcomes would sort of link with the business outcomes. So for example, let me think of an example. If you were a pharmaceutical business where research and development was really important, making sure that you have the best environment, a succession plan for those research roles, that you're making a desirable employer brand, they would all be really important. So that's directly linked to the business outcome.
On that point, I always get the question, how do I become more strategic in a way of, how do I get myself in front of senior leaders to the point where I then know what is a priority for the business?
So I think you can, if you're in a business partnering role, obviously you'll tend to be at different points within the business. So I think the first step would be whoever you business partner, treat them like they're an executive. So it might be that they're in like a head of or lower down in the organization, away from the executive board. But I think absolutely take that time to really understand what ticks in their part of the business. So it might be that these are their 3 priorities. How does that then link to the overall plan? Because if you think about a cascade of goals, if a company needs to make £50 million in revenue, that might be then divided up and they're responsible for 10 million of that. So, you're seeing your link there by doing a really good job with that stakeholder to then, link up to the overall business plan. I think going through that, as we talked about, if you have the opportunity to take on additional work, potentially then you'll be put in front of more senior people. Or I think sometimes it's a matter of asking. So I'd often say, I'd like to come along to this particular meeting, understand more about it, or meet this stakeholder. And don't be afraid of asking. I think if you senior people, if you show enthusiasm, so you want to come and learn, see how you can make an impact, or even if it's another bit of the business that you say, look, I've only ever worked with, say, Raw Mail example, I've only ever worked with parcels. I'd like to learn more about letters. You could go and speak to that person over there.
I absolutely love that. And I think that it's knowing as well, just because we have a title of HR doesn't mean that we can't collaborate with other departments as well, because when we are building out a people strategy, it should underpin the business strategy. But to do that, we've got to know the business strategy. We've got to understand what is a priority. And that all starts with the communication on the inside. And also, if we're not doing that, are we still staying in the compliance lane that a lot of us are quite stuck in?
Yeah, I think with this whole debate, there's a bit of, some of it can be how organisationally you are. So I think sometimes HR can be quite strategic as a function already. Therefore, if you're in it, you're then almost set up to succeed. I think a lot of smaller businesses aren't necessarily like that. And I can certainly remember times when I've been chasing whether someone's appraisals have been done and then feeling a great feeling of happiness when I've got to 100%. But that is very much HR policing. I think going back to what you said about stakeholders, what I certainly found in a big corporate business was the two main stakeholders for me were finance and commercial. So if I was pulling a plan together, I don't know if it was a 3-year plan and I was going to make some particular changes, I would work with finance to cost that up. So I don't know if for every one saving I make, this would save X amount of money, and then this would add up to that overall. So therefore, you've got a 3-year people plan that I would lead. You'd then have a plan that was backed up by finance. And then I think commercial is the other key stakeholder, because that might be that, as a result of putting this change in, making this cost saving, therefore that means, I don't know, you could reduce the price of the product to customers, or it might have this extra feature or benefit. And therefore, if I was then going into a board meeting, you could almost sell that, look, this is the people plan, but it's been backed up by that financial plan and the commercial plan. So I think they certainly two stakeholders to get really close to.
And for anybody listening, I don't know if you agree with this, the one key piece of advice I would give is it's never too early to start these relationships. Even being more junior in your career, don't wait until you're a HR business partner to start to form those relationships. The earlier, the better, in my opinion. I'd love if we could talk around the key steps in aligning a people strategy with a business strategy. Is there anything for our listeners that you would recommend for them to put in motion now?
So in terms of those key steps, I think the first one is around understanding the business strategy. So I think rather than just going straight into, well, what's the people side of it, take a step back. Don't think of anything to do with people. Look at the business strategy. So is that to increase revenue by 20 million? Is it about growing the business by 50 people? Is it about shrinking the business by 50 people? What is the business wanting? And I think from that, you then pull out those people implications. So I think the first bit is just to really immerse yourself in that business strategy, and then then build your people strategy off the back of that. I think identify what those implications are. So for example, if it's a new product that's been launched next year, does that mean that we need people with that particular skill set? Can that be retrained? Does it mean that we're going to need new people to do that? So that's kind of what I say when I mean identifying people implications. I think collaborate with leaders, and I think you can do this firstly within HR, to say, this is the plan. I don't know if you're a business partner, you could go and get input from the HR director or the leadership team to say, look, this is my plan. This is how it links to the business. Here's the outcome. That would be great for both getting that sort of rubber stamp on the plan, but also getting you that exposure and kind of showing, look, I've got this plan that's related to the business outcomes. I think the other bit would be about, well, what's the impact going to be? So have you got something that's really measurable? So if it is something around headcount or trading or succession, these are the measures that you're going to measure it on. And I think one of the things that we often forget in HR is when you meet those is to communicate and demonstrate that impact. So I had this strategy. This was at the beginning of the year. At the end of the year, I said I was going to do 1, 2, 3. I've actually done all of those. And actually, we've done this additional thing. And here's the impact for the business. Because I think there's a bit of sometimes we sell, I've certainly done this in the past, you'll sell yourself within the HR function, but not shout wider to say, look, this is the business impact that I've had.
And talking the business language.
Yes, absolutely.
That is one of the biggest lessons that I learned, because I was so focused on HR jargon, processes and procedures. I wasn't elevating my speech for language that aligned for the business and priorities for the business as well. You just started to talk around workforce planning. And I would really appreciate for us to continue to talk about how we can properly plan with our team, but also to be inclusive. And I know if anybody doesn't follow Harry on LinkedIn, he gives incredible content around diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. Little plug there.
Yeah, little plug, but and so why is workforce planning so important in that lens?
Yes, I think diversity and inclusion is just so important, and I think it's one of those things that we as a HR function we almost become custodians of. But really, it's I always say it's not our problem. Really, it's the whole business's problem, and we should all make it work. Let me give you an example. So there was a part of a business that I used to work with that was a really high performing bit of the business, and when we looked at managers, we had sort of a skew towards male managers, and there was no reason, this is a job that we've got successful female managers, so actually, how can we almost replicate that and have a bit more of a balance? So when you look at from a workforce planning perspective, it's to say, right, well, speak to these women who are high performing that do these roles, understand what their motivations were to do the role. Do they have any challenges maybe that men don't have in the workplace? And sometimes, and certainly the scenario that I had, it came down to sometimes a lack of confidence. It's one of the, I think it's a well-established thing that sometimes a woman will look at a job description and see all the things they can't do, and a man looks at it and sees everything they can do. So sometimes those gender stereotypes do come true in my research. So what I did was to say, right, well, actually, if we want to have a better representation of women, I set a target with the MD for that business to say we're going to have X amount by the end of the year. It's still going to be the best person for the job because we're not going to discriminate in the resourcing process. But what you can do is to say, right, well, we're going to identify where different high potential women are that are maybe like the step below manager, supervisor level, give them sort of training and support, mentorship from senior people. And then what happens is that kind of builds that confidence. So when a job comes up, they're then applying for it. So you've got them in the mix and then it goes through. And I saw really good results with that. But what I will say is you have to be careful how you balance things. So in that scenario, whilst it was really strong and it was all about promoting women, I did have some people contact me to say, men, I'd feel like I'm going to leave because, you're just focused on women. So it was a bit of, you have to balance some of the rhetoric to say, actually, this is about, helping and inspiring people, giving them that confidence. We're happy to mentor men if you're feeling in the same situation. And one of the turning points we had there was we got men to record videos of like what they thought of it, what they thought were inspiring women within the business. Oh my God, these videos had like grown men in tears like that. And they were talking about, I really admire this woman and this is what she's done and this is what she's done for the business. And that was a real turning point because it was about how men in leadership positions could help foster and bring women through. And that kind of lens flipped the script on that.
That is so inspiring. And it also sounds really powerful as a way. And I love the way that you've mentioned around balance, because I think at the moment there is quite a fear of doing things as a tick box process. And, am I the female card in that example? And you're right, it comes down to the communication and how are we enabling our team to be more inclusive, to be more diverse in our planning. I love that. Great example.
Yeah, and I think you can look at that from a few different perspectives. So for listeners, you could say that was from a gender perspective. Mm-hmm. It could be that you've actually got a good gender mix within a business and you might want to look at, is it certain skills you want to bring in? Could be a bit more like diversity of thought. So a lot of times when you're applying for roles, sometimes people will say, what's your background? So actually, have we got all public school, top universities here? Do we need, it's that diversity of thought. So there's different ways you can look at it. And I think one of the main things is getting that agreement from the business up front. That's what's going to have that buy-in. So I know I did that and I had a razor sharp focus every month. We would review those figures and it would be like a joint success. It wouldn't be that if I suddenly, I've done this, I've managed to increase this 2%. It was never that. It was we've managed to do this and you need to jointly own it. Because where I have seen it go wrong is where, that's a HR target, the business don't buy in and it's just like, oh, I'm not going to get involved in that. It's stupid. It's just HR fluff.
And if it doesn't come from the top and if we don't get that buy-in early, I've seen a lot of projects fail because we haven't got that buy-in or we haven't got the business on board in terms of what impact it's going to make. And again, going back to that language that we need to talk about when we're becoming more strategic. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't know how. And I think it would be really lovely for us to talk about how do we, for the people who are listening, how can they measure the impact that an HR function is having on a business?
So I think some of this is easier than other parts, and I'll explain what I mean by that. There's a bit of an ominous start to the question. So I think there's certain things that you can look at where you can get a clear return on investment. So I think that's a good place to start. I think just actually before I go into that, so just picking it up, is when we talk about using the right language, I think one of the things that's important for HR professionals is to really understand finance language. So how like return on investment, EBITDA, all of these other parts, and actually how does that work? So I think that will help in this. So if I come back to the answer, if you look at a return on investment, so there's often things that are, I always call it like low-hanging fruit that you can focus on. So if it's a well-being initiative, for example, how could that reduce absence? So if you've got absence at 3% and it's that costs X amount, so times that by the amount of people, and you think that that's going to, I don't know, say your absence is £5 million, and you're going to invest £1 million in this well-being project, and actually even if that reduces thing by 1% or by 1 million, that's going to have paid for itself. So I always think that's one. But what you have to be careful about there is, certainly in a big business, is other people might be counting the same savings. So it might be that your project here is doing it and then some others are. So that's where it's really important to work with finance to make sure there's not double counting. I think that's the more easier ones. I think where it can become more difficult is around if you want to do a traditional return on investment for something like, I don't know, a diversity initiative, that's where it can get more difficult. So for example, if I was asking for, I don't know, £10,000 to attend a Pride parade, like how are you going to monetize that to say this is the benefit it will give? And I think that's where those relationships with the senior leaders are really important. And, because you need to say, look, I want this money to sort of do this. This is kind of the impact it will have. So it will help employer brand. Yep. It will show that we're an LGBTQ plus inclusive employer. For our own employees, they want to see you at Pride, and you can't necessarily monetize those things. So you're kind of just saying, look, this is £10,000 well spent, and this is the impact. And sometimes it's one of those things that we have to be seen to be doing, which sounds wrong, but it's the right thing to do. That's probably the right way to phrase it. So I think that's part of it. I think the other bit is around metrics that you can link to the business outcomes. So I've been in situations where declining parts of the business, you need to reduce headcount. So if it's, I don't know, if you're going in with 5,000 people, you need to reduce that to 4,500. So that would be a clear metric there. So where do you start at the beginning of the year? Where does that finish? What was the savings? How did you achieve that? So was that just natural attrition? You didn't replace people? Was there some form of, voluntary redundancy within that? So you can kind of build all of that up to say you went from X to Y. Here was the saving. Here's what you spent, and here's the overall one. So I think there's often when you look at that within businesses, you can get quite creative. So it could be that, I don't know, if you've got an employee engagement index, could this be this thing here might increase that over there. So use metrics that the business are used to seeing like that in headcount versus, maybe coming up with some other ones that might be valid, but the leadership aren't going to understand those.
And metrics is such a key point. Data doesn't lie. It's hard facts. And the way that technology is advancing now, we are getting that hard data that allows us to really show the impact. And I think, sadly, as a profession, we haven't been seen as an impact function. We've been seen as more of a cost than anything, because we are not the people making sales. So we're not driving revenue from that perspective, from an immediate impact. Our impact, I would say, is more of a long-term investment. And that's where getting the business on side to understand the role that HR actually plays in a business, I think there's a lot of the time, not every business understands what HR's role actually is.
Yeah, and I think it's about really demonstrating that. So I know I've certainly been in situations where I'm the one producing that data, and it might be all perfectly produced packs every month or every week that shows this is the data, but really it's, so what? You could have the best data in the world, but you've got to say, what is this showing you? So it might be that you start small and say, right, well, actually I've seen a peak in absence, or, there seems to be another from a survey, there's something here that's of concern, but actually then, so it's taking that data, which is just a really small part of it and say, right, well, actually, I'm seeing that absence related to, I don't know, mental health is increasing. So actually, rather than allowing that this current trajectory to get to, I don't know, 1% to 3%, which is how it's looking, how can you introduce something and address it? And then that's going to be showing real value to the business rather than just having great data. Obviously, in an ideal world, you'd have a system that would be self-serve where, people could go in and see that. But it's all about your starting point in your business. But I think if you are in a role and you're not stuck, but you're in that less strategic place and you are producing data, kind of don't make it all about that. It's about what are the insights and kind of really drive through that. And that should help lift your profile within the business.
Would you encourage anybody who is more junior in their career to get to understand data and what that means earlier on compared to at the more strategic point? Do you think that's something that we should be working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I look back at my career, I think I was always more data minded, given I had an IT degree.
Of course.
So I would just I would spend hours looking at systems and what does this show and, how do I find this? And I think that pays dividends later on in your career because you can find that. So in some businesses, you may have a team that produces the data and then other ones you might be in there going to have a look. So I think familiarizing yourself with that, but I think not just the people data. I think I found reading company reports from the last couple of years, because I think often, especially if it's a really thick one, it often means they're hiding something juicy somewhere within that, I tend to find, whereas if it's a really thin one, it tends to be quite straightforward. So I think reading that, seeing what what one of the non-executive boards are saying and the data that they've got in there, coming back to what we said earlier around finances, so you'll often find lots of interesting things in there, and there's often a bit around the people metrics. I know one thing I found interesting, or might just be a geek doing this, is to say, look at the last 3 years, what did they say about people? Did that come true? Did that follow through? And then I think that's kind of linking what you might then see in your HR system to actually the business outcomes. Because those company reports have a lot of good stuff in them.
And that's such a key point. And unfortunately, they're not always shared as well. So I think quite a battle that we have is getting access to those high-level conversations, information and data as well. For our listeners who are more junior in their career, they aspire to be HR director one day, exactly as you are. How do you think that they can be seen in the business?
I think it's shown that genuine curiosity. I think that's certainly what I did. So it was about saying, I want to go and find out about this part of the business and go and ask somebody, what did Kamala Harris say? I eat no for breakfast. I think it's a bit like that. So I think don't take no for an answer almost, but don't be too pushy because nobody likes that. So I think there's a bit of, you can ask questions to say, I'd like to find out more about this. A good way in, I've just remembered actually, is if there's a part of the business that you want to understand about, go and speak to that business partner first. Find out what they think, who their key people are, maybe shadow them, and then you'll find out, that's kind of opening up via more of a safe route almost with HR. And then I think there's the other bit about going and speaking to leaders to say, look, could I have 10 minutes of your time? I'd really like to find out more about this. Or, I don't know, I aspire to be in reward, for example. Go and speak to that person. And I think, taking those opportunities to do that. Another way is to sort of speak to the HR leadership within the business to say, we want to, if your meetings are very HR focused, how do you elevate that? So maybe get key people in from the business to come and talk. So they come in and do that, and I don't know if it's a commercial director, marketing, etc. They can come and speak to the HR audience and say, this is what the business strategy is, and this is how you can help as HR professionals. That kind of saves them saying it 20 times to every person in the team.
So true.
That really, really works.
So true. And I also think with the way that work dynamics are shifting now, we've got office teams, hybrid teams, and remote teams as well. If there was a way that these conversations could be happening more regularly, where we do have different stakeholders within the business that then give an insight, we're giving people opportunities to grow within their career as well. They get that commercial awareness that so many of us don't have access to. And for large companies, there can sometimes be a disconnect between that as well. And I completely agree. I think as HR professionals, we should be asking more questions and asking to understand, hey, how do you see HR playing a role within your business? Because here is what I think as well, and how we could create an impact. And HR professionals we're people.
Yes.
At the end of the day.
Absolutely.
So we want to give people the resources. We want to enable them to thrive within their environment. And no question is a silly question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just thinking about that, something else that really worked was if you've got a particular project or, initiative that you're working on, is to share that within the HR function. So I'd have regular HR calls to say, look, I might be working on this, I don't know, transformation in customer experience, just picking something random. If you share that and say, look, this is the problem, this is what I'm working on, here's the key stakeholders, often you'll get that wider input. And actually it might be, I work in operations, and actually that project is going to have an impact on us. So had you thought about that? And then naturally that kind of gets HR working outside of its silos as well. So that's another top tip.
Oh, that's another good one. Our listeners will literally be writing all of these down. I know.
You're going back with a list of things to set up. It's one of those things that you don't realise until we're talking, that more and more of them come to mind, the way that you can, because I think so much can be around within HR that this is my job, this is what I've got to do, this is my lane almost, and I'm going to be the best person possible to do this. But I think back to some feedback I had that was, I was really well known in one bit of the business, really good reputation and all of this, but I was unknown elsewhere. And it was because I was so focused on delivering that great HR for that area of the business, but forgetting about, it's like that personal brand, in the rest of the business.
One of the best ways that I learned was getting out of that HR lane.
Yes.
Accelerated my career. I got in front of the right people. I had business awareness that I wouldn't have had if I'd have stayed in that particular lane. So yeah, I think that is incredible advice. You've given us so many good topics during this conversation. And one final piece that I would love for us to touch on is looking back in your career. So looking back at the last 15 years, what is one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self?
Well, can I be cheeky and give two pieces of advice?
Go on, let's have it.
So I think the first one is to build business acumen early.
Yes.
So I think this isn't HR processes, procedures, that's all really important, but it goes back to what I said earlier. It's about understanding the business. How do they make money? What's their products? What are the leadership's priorities? And for big listed businesses, a lot of this should be public knowledge, or you can go out and ask and make sure you ask that, and then you're going to be in front of the right people asking those questions. I think the second bit is about never underestimate the relationship building side of things. Sometimes a business will have written down, this is how you get a project agreed. But in reality, it's not those 4 steps. There's a million steps in between that. And it's about having those relationships, being able to pick up the phone and say, hang on a minute, why hasn't this been approved? Having those relationships so people trust you. So I think it's business acumen and relationships. Really focus on those in addition to sort of the basis of HR processes and knowledge.
I'm obsessed. Love that. And I know from my perspective, I wish I'd have built relationships sooner. I was especially because I progressed from admin, I was just so focused on the transactional side of HR and thinking okay, I don't really need to build relationships now. I just need to master my craft. That would have helped me massively in my career. And I know our listeners, hopefully now, will be getting that on your priority list.
Yeah, we've now got an answer to when people say, HR, be more strategic. Just listen to this podcast. Yeah. We've got all the answers.
All the answers are in this podcast.
Yeah.
Harry, thank you so much for today. I've loved our conversation. Such valuable insights. And I can't wait for everyone to hear it.
Thank you, Georgia.
Thank you. Bye.